All right, welcome back. This is the third presentation of Chapter 3 on federalism. As I mentioned, federalism is a difficult subject. You're going to be well advised to take your time and study these issues very carefully. Again, we're looking at the basic ways that federalism has evolved and shaped and changed the country in terms of governance. And it's important to keep in mind, federalism, the fact that you have a central government and then you have subsidiary state governments that have sovereignty of a sort, and you have a compound republic, that has implications for how we govern. So national and state powers have shifted quite a bit over time. At the founding, the national government had little direct involvement in the day-to-day lives of individual Americans. Most of the governance happened at the state level. Certain significant events increased the power and authority of the federal government. Certainly the massive expansion of the territorial size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase was one of those important things. Then, of course, you get the Civil War. Shortly after the Civil War, you get the Industrial Revolution. All these things, what happens? More size, the country is larger, more people to govern. That adds to the complexity of the governing challenges. And then, of course, you get industrialization. The economy is rapidly growing. The population is moving from a largely rural population to an increasingly urban population. And all those have, significant implications and present significant challenges to state governance. So federal responsibilities dramatically expand over the course of the 20th century. And again, one of the most significant things that happens really in the post-World War II era, and keep in mind the Great Depression and World War II significantly strengthen the hand of the federal government. But then in the 1960s, you also get the Civil Rights Movement, and then you get the environmental movement, and those two movements and the associated other civil rights movements, again, kind of draw on the federal government to cause people to be treated more fairly. And then, of course, the environmental movement is basically saying we have to protect the environment. Alongside the environmental movement, you also get a lot of consumer protection laws coming into play. And again, the federal government is playing a much more confrontational role in telling states you can't discriminate against people, and that is pulling the federal and state governments into an increasingly conflictual relationship. Regulated federalism, again, you get the rise, this is what I've been mentioning in the previous slide. You get an increasingly greater amount of expectation that the federal government will do things, to try and protect people. So a critical question for federalism: in what issue areas is it acceptable for states to differ from one another? The Supreme Court has generally decided which areas should have a more uniform standard of application. And again, beginning in the 1960s, Congress begins legislating in new areas, creating an era known as regulated federalism. And again, that's where, the federal government is increasingly saying to the states, you have to meet certain kinds of standards as it relates to education, as it relates to environmental protection, as it relates to access to medical care. Again, in the new era, the national government was more willing to coerce states and local governments in order to achieve national goals. Federalism today is as important as ever. There are lots and lots of controversies that persist over the role and responsibilities of each level of government in the process of governing. Questions regarding the role of federalism. Again, if states can act as laboratories of democracies, they might also act as laboratories of tyranny. And again, in what areas are we prepared to allow states to discriminate for whatever reason? And again, the argument could be because we're protecting children, or because we're, keeping the country free of illegal immigrants or whatever. Those are questions that, again, are continuing to be adjudicated in terms of how federalism is going to work. States' rights, again, this is the constitutional rationale for states' rights resides with the 10th Amendment, the Reserved Powers Clause that basically says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states or to the people. So extreme versions of states' rights in the early 19th century took the form of what was known as nullification, which was the argument that the states could effectively say no to national laws. Even in the, that basically resulted in the arguments about secession, or evolved into those arguments about secession, and eventually, created the Civil War, or the pretext for the Civil War. By the late 1930s, Supreme Court interpretations had greatly expanded the authority of the federal government and had significantly sort of eroded the power of state governments. And some scholarship of that period basically suggested that states were effectively hopeless. They were hopelessly corrupt and ineffective in terms of providing a sound and rational basis for governance. States' rights kind of resurge in the 1930s over the course of the New Deal and into the period of regulated federalism in 1930. A group of Southern scholars wrote the book, basically, I'll Take My Stand, which was the rise, represents the rise of the Southern agrarians, and basically saying that the South had a right to have waged the Civil War, and kind of resurged or reacquired the whole argument around states' rights. You also had the Southern Manifesto, which during the Brown versus Board of Education debates basically argued that Southern states were not constitutionally bound by Supreme Court decisions. So the civil rights movement effectively tainted the whole states' rights argument with the stigma of racism. Nevertheless, in the 1980s, you saw a resurgence of states' rights arguments by conservatives, basically saying that states' rights provides an important lever. And again, a lot of the scholarship in that period in the 1980s is effectively ideologically conservative and reflecting sort of the Reagan sensibilities of conservatism. And over the course of from the 1980s to the present, the conservatives have pushed for an increasingly conservative view of American jurisprudence, of how the law should be interpreted, and they have packed the courts with judicial conservatives of a certain stripe. So who are Americans? Who benefits from federal funding? When you look in terms of the federal grants to state and local government, a significant proportion of that is going to healthcare, right? Look at we're talking about billions of dollars here, $618 billion for healthcare, $195 billion for income security, again largely reflecting concerns from COVID-19, $101 billion for transportation, largely owing to Joe Biden's infrastructure packages, $107 billion for education. That's a lot of money that's going to the state and local governments from the federal government. If you look at who are Americans, these are transfers. And again, this is, the argument here is that some states benefit more from federalism than others. And it's surprising oftentimes who are the big beneficiaries. A lot of the southern states, if you look at it, Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, New Mexico, South Carolina to a lesser extent, Oklahoma, get more back from the federal government than they send in terms of taxation and everything else that goes out. And then there's a lot of states that actually are, they send more out than they receive, and that, and those are again the high economy states like California, Washington, New York, and so forth. So again, federal-state tensions, federalism these days is characterized by this sort of conflict between the federal government and state governments in a couple of basic issues. And I'm going to close this presentation with the first issue. Are state and local governments required to assist in enforcing federal immigration laws? The Obama administration adopted sort of a complex approach to immigration. And in fact, early in the day, they were, kind of forcing local governments to help immigration and customs enforcement in terms of identifying and rounding up undocumented immigrants. Ultimately, the Supreme Court held that local officials cannot be dragooned by the federal government to do things that they don't want to do. And ultimately, again, as the 2012 election approached and Obama recognized he needed the Hispanic vote to win re-election, he really reversed course and adopted a much more, again, this is where the deferred action for Dreamers came into play. Again, Trump came to power basically saying, I'm going to build a wall and I'm going to wage war on sanctuary cities. And again, this is why the battle lines over immigration have hardened. Let's keep in mind, I want to say something very important here. Our economy is better, and recovered from COVID a lot better than most of the other advanced industrialized nations of the world. And the reason is immigration, because those folks are working and they're keeping our economy going. A lot of countries where there's not a lot of immigration and most advanced, industrial economies, the birth rate begins to fall because, again, it makes less sense to have large families when you're working in an industrial economy. And the result is their economies are contracting. If you look at Japan and Germany and a lot of those countries, without immigration, your economy begins to have problems. And so part of the reason why the United States economy has continued to do well is the fact that we continue to bring in large numbers of people. So that's something to think about as we move into this last presentation on federalism. And I'll see you next time.